So I'm going to talk about pollenizers, but I'm also going to throw in a little bit about hollow heart. And I know that Gordon has done a lot of work on that as well over the last several years. In fact, I'm going to use one of his pictures in here. And so we'll get started. So I thought I would just mention this. This gives you an idea that there is a Cucurbit portal. And if you were to Google a Cucurbit portal site, one of the things you'll find, among other things, is the Cucurbit cultivar evaluations and variety trials. And on there as well as you'll have all that wonderful information about disease management and different diseases from Lena as well, and a host of other things. So one can find it there. The other thing that you'll find there is we do regular Cucurbit evaluations just about every year. And so here's a listing of, if you were to go to that site, you could pick up and see all these watermelon evaluations. We did not do one last year because of the COVID restrictions, but that's one reason I wanted to hear what Gordon had to say, because he always has a very nice study as well each year, as he mentioned. But one of the things that you see in that title is we take a lot of data, and sometimes there's an opportunity to learn additional things if you just could have the time to kind of associate some of the data with one another. There was some work we did with rind thickness, and years ago, a fella in a program looked at rind thickness for pickling purposes, and he published that from our data that we collected from some of these variety studies. And actually, that's one of the things that's, I see a lot of citations, a lot of people that are interested in reading that article. But another area that we were very interested in is the association of, is there an association between the firmness of the flesh in a watermelon versus hollow heart? And we look at those kind of we look at that information, but not relate that to one another. And we had a student who was working on hollow heart, and she was working on some of those aspects and quality aspects as far as firmness. Her name is Marley. She just finished up her PhD, and she did a lot of chemistry work to look at what was different between hollow heart versus non-hollow heart. But she went ahead and mined that data to see if there was that relationship between flesh firmness and hollow heart. And so this was actually supported, our variety testing, at least by the USDA NEFA project that Lena mentioned, QCAP. And then there's the actual link that one could get to go to the variety trials. So I thought I'd mention that. So we see a lot of, we don't see a lot of hollow heart when it comes to seeded watermelons, but I happen to see this one on the internet, and you don't want to see this, but you do see this to be more prevalent in seedless watermelon. This is, of course, a very severe case. And this is a case that actually Gordon Johnson published. I've never quite seen it like this, but it's quite artistic, but probably wouldn't be thought very kindly if this was what your field looked like, if you had a bunch of hollow-hearted melons that looked like this. And so when we kind of rate for hollow heart, what we do is we give it a 0 rating on that melon on the left, and then a 1 rating on the next one. And then in the middle, that can either be marketable or not marketable, sort of depending on what the market conditions are. If there's a lot of watermelons in the market, this perhaps could be turned down because of the hollow heart being a little bit more severe. And of course, if you look at the two melons on the right, why those melons, those would be not marketable. Those would be a real problem. So there are several factors that impact the frequency of hollow heart. There are many, actually. A couple key ones is you just don't get enough pollen produced from the male flowers of a pollenizer plant. You need viable pollen coming from a seeded pollenizer plant. The transfer of that pollen from those seeded plants to flowers of seedless plants by bees may not even occur at a high enough level. So you might have the pollen, but then you got to have the bees to move the pollen. The pollen may not be viable. Let's say it's not very good conditions in the morning. By later in the day, the pollen isn't as viable. And then, of course, genetics or cultivars could play a pretty big role. And so there's this kind of graphic was put together by Marley, and I'm borrowing that because there are many factors that appear to affect the incidence of hollow heart, particularly aspects related to environmental factors. If you have cooler mornings, honeybees don't tend to fly as much. If you have rainfall, they don't want to go out in the rain, much like we don't want to go out in the rain. And she looked at some things at a deeper level where she was in a lot of her dissertation work to see if there were more cells produced that might be indicate more firmness and be smaller versus fewer cells that were bigger. But there are a number of things that can play a role. Nutrient stress is another one that's been looked at quite a bit. So I have basically 2 slides to sort of show to capture what she looked at. And she looked at data from 2012, 13, and 14 on those cultivar evaluations of watermelon. And the way this is oriented on the vertical axis on your left, you can see it goes from 0 to 50. That's the percentage of hollow heart. And then the numbers that you see above these blue lines, that's how firm the flesh was. And so the higher the number, the firmer the flesh. And then each of these bars correspond to a particular variety. And we had all those common varieties across those 3 years of testing. And I think the thing to note here is that Liberty and Bold Ruler had like some of the less firm flesh. Now there were softer flesh versus something like Crunchy Red and Maxima had very firm flesh. And what you'll see is you had more hollow heart, up around 40%, with less firm flesh or softer flesh, and not so much hollow heart when you had a firmer flesh. Now, it's not a perfect match, but you can see that it follows along pretty well. Let's look at it a little bit differently. And this is a graph that you can use to kind of explain and fit a model. And it accounts for about 60% of the results, but not all of it. It's not a perfect match. But again, you sort of see the firmness as the number goes up. You see that Maxima and Crunchy Red again are way up there. And so as you get lower, softer flesh, you get more hollow heart. And you see that as you go, this line depicts that very well. So I thought that would be something to be just aware of. It's not a perfect match. We've always wondered if that was the case, but we actually had someone go out and run the stats and this information to sort of show that. So in summary, there are certain cultivars that are more prone to hollow heart, and firmer flesh watermelon cultivars are correlated with less incidence of hollow heart based on that work. So I want to transition now into the pollenizer considerations. And some of the important considerations are you need to have a really consistent supply of viable pollen in order to get good fruit set, good fruit quality in seedless fruits, including hollow heart, I think is probably an important aspect. The time of flowering throughout the season is important, particularly if you want to extend your season or you want to match the time when your seedless fruit are ready to be set. So the number of male flowers from a seeded variety or a diploid need to be reasonable. You don't want a pollenizer to have to be too competitive with your seedless plants, because that may limit your ability to size the fruit, or perhaps if it's so competitive, it may be more difficult for the bees to get in there and pollinate if it was very competitive. The vining habit, you want a decent vining habit so it kind of moves the vine more in proximity to where the flowers are for seedless watermelons. And one of the other considerations that I know more growers on the East Coast are looking at is a dual role of using the pollenizer not only as a pollen provider, but perhaps those watermelons, even though they're seeded, there's a marketplace for them and they can go ahead and sell them. There's others that are just only used for pollen source or called dedicated pollenizers, as I will refer to them as such. And so we kind of looked at all those things in green. We didn't really look at the competition between seedless, between plants and seedless and seeded varieties together. These were run just looking at how a pollenizer plant would perform without competition. What's the best case scenario when we looked at these factors that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. It's if for those who are out here and have grown for a long time, but anybody who might possibly be new, you definitely want to make sure that when you're growing a seedless watermelon, you pick a pollenizer that has a different colored rind pattern. And most of them do not have this more solid light green rind pattern. So you always need to consider that as well when you're selecting a pollenizer, as well as some of these other factors that we're going to look at. So the objectives that we had as far as what we wanted to look at was to evaluate pollenizers mainly for vine habit and flowering habit, and then sort of just recheck and see how those might do, some of those varieties as far as used for marketing or potential sales. And so we looked at a series of dedicated pollenizers where all they did was supply pollen for the most part, or we looked at those that had dual purpose where they could supply pollen and also be used perhaps for commercial sales. And we kind of picked some of the key varieties or cultivars that might be used for commercial sales that are usually being used, just to see what their flowering habit was. And then we sort of got our hands or got a hold of whatever we could of these other commercial pollenizers that were available, because it's been a while since we've actually looked at that. We did look at this, but it's been 10 or 15 years. And I might mention that the North Carolina Watermelon Association was the one who funded this project and was very interested in looking at these things. So this is the listing of the pollenizer cultivars that were evaluated, and you can see the corresponding seed company. And so there's a pretty good number here. I think there's a total of 15. And those that are generally those that are highlighted in green are those that might be sold as dual purpose, whereas the others that are in black, those would be those that are sold just as a dedicated pollenizer. Now, one of the things we've talked a lot about, you've heard a lot about disease from both of the presenters before, and Gordon kind of gave some pretty good information about some of the varieties. I was real interested in that. Accomplice has a pretty good, and this is according to what I could find in the catalog. So I haven't actually gone out and tested it, whereas I think some of the testing that Gordon was talking about was actually looked at more specifically to document that. But Accomplice had a high resistance to anthracnose and intermediate resistance to the IRs to Fusarium races 0 and 1. And then you see some of the others. I know like Ace Plus, for example. Ace used to not have any intermediate resistance hardly to Fusarium, but they at least have some of that. And so I think the plus on there is that increased resistance to Fusarium. And you can just see a whole bunch of other different ones. There's a few in here I just didn't know what the resistances were. I looked, for example, to see what Sentinel was. It's a variety that's been around. It's a seeded one that's been around obviously for a while. But I couldn't find on some of these varieties what the listing was for, even at their site. I couldn't find something that would tell me what their disease package was. But that's something always to keep in mind. So just to give you an idea a little bit how we did this, we did grow it on black plastic and drip irrigation. And we had 5 plants per 5 plant plots. They were 5 feet between the plants to give them an area that they could grow out normally. We also had 10 foot between the rows, which I didn't list. We seeded these, and this was done in 2019. We were supposed to give this talk similar to this last year, and they canceled the meeting right at COVID time. So I'm glad we're getting a chance to kind of review this today. We transplanted that crop May 23rd. This was done at the Cunningham Research Station in Kinston. Like I said, 15 entries, and the number of dedicated and dual purpose pollinizers we included in the study. And we basically evaluated vine length and flowering every week, starting from week 1 through week 7 after we transplanted in the field. So let's look at, this is a shot of the plots, and this is how it looked later in June. And this is a lot of data here. This is every cultivar that you see here. And this looks at, we looked at the longest vine to get a kit to characterize what the plant growth was. And I'm not so worried about all this spaghetti of different colors that you see in this upper part, because they're all pretty similar as far as their vine length. But what you do recognize is that there's this blue line and this purple line, and they only grew out to be about 60 inches in length when we looked at this at 7 weeks after they've been planted, whereas it was nearly, not quite twice as much, but considerably more vine growth on these other vines. And we had to quit because then it got just too labor intensive to try to be able to separate the vines and to measure these kind of things. So if we looked at that, and here it is, those are the two, Accomplice and Sidekick were the two that had more compact type plants. So that's just something to keep in mind. So they're not going to reach across as much, at least into the other plantings, because of their more compact vine habit. Now let's look at these. This is sort of an idea how it looks. Sidekick and Accomplice were the compact plants that we saw at that time. And you can see as some examples, SP7, and actually this doesn't show quite as much sentinel as you might think vine length, but they're starting to vine out, just a little different growth habit. But all those had all the others besides Accomplice and Sidekick tended to grow out much more than those two cultivars. So let's look at flowering, because that's probably the thing that we were most interested in. And so we're going to talk about that. I'm going to show some information. You're going to see a similar type of graph. And this is, wow, it's a lot of stuff here, all the different cultivars in here. And this is the flower counts that we did on a per plant basis. And so we did a snapshot at 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 weeks after transplanting. This is the number of plants that go up on your vertical axis. So you can kind of see the higher the line and the quicker the line elevates, the earlier the flowering and the more the flowering. Those that are shaded are those areas that are the dual purpose or the non-dedicated pollenizers. The others not shaded are the dedicated pollenizers. So if we move on and we look at the next slide, we take a few of those lines out. These are the dedicated pollenizers, but it's still pretty messy, isn't it, to see anything? So let's just look at the 3 lines that I think are probably the most important that I got out of this, really out of this whole study. And I was very interested in how this panned out. But you'll notice that the black line is your SP6 from Syngenta. Your SP7 is the newer pollenizer that's mainly being offered now by, and I think you have to go through their full count program. But they by Syngenta. And then the other thing that's interesting is this purple line, and this is Wingman. This is from Seminis. This was definitely one of the earlier producer of flowers than anything that we had there. Now, eventually you got just as many flowers produced from SP6 or 7, but you definitely had earliness as far as the number of flowers that were being produced at 25, 30 per plant. The others never reached much higher than that, if I recall, and we'll look at those in just a moment. If we add the 3 next best producing pollenizers that were dedicated, this dark purple line is Accomplice, Co-Pilot is that yellow line, and then the blue line there is Sidekick. So you can see it's not any earlier and it's less production of flowers. And then if we look at the remaining lines, you can see they're all lower. And you'll see those. And you could look at this a little more closely because you can go back to this if you'd like to review this, because it will be posted on that Cultivar Portal website. So if we transition and we look at those that have kind of a dual purpose, there wasn't all that much difference between those different types. And what I want to note is that, you know, a lot of these are, number of these are reaching at least several, around 20 flowers per plant, but there's none of these that ever reach above 14 flowers per plant. So that never is quite as good with this, with those that you might sell, at least in this study. And this is a one-shot deal. We've only looked at this 1 year and like to repeat that. In fact, Nettie Bauer is going to be working on her Master of Horticultural Science, and she's going to probably do a similar test. She may add a few other cultivars and some different wrinkles to that study, but we'd like to repeat that as part of her project she's doing toward her master's degree. But the thing that probably, the variety that probably looked the best of the cultivar was Mickey Lee, and then the next best, I guess, was Sentinel. And then the others were pretty similar. And so you'd see a peak, and then they sort of went down, and that's probably the number of flowers going down when your fruit were being set on the plant. And so there was less male flower production. And then once the vines grew out, you start to see this reemerge perhaps later. And then it got to be hard to sort all this out because of the vines tangling up. So that's the whole thing again, but hopefully I broke it down where you could look at that. So let me summarize here in just a moment after we look at some of the fruit. So again, ACE Plus is dedicated, obviously, as far as just providing pollen. A very same thing, accomplished. Very, it's a thinner skin type. It's very light red. Another co-pilot, and then Mickey Lee. And I might mention, we just kind of grabbed these fruits because our intent was not to look at the super quality of the fruits. We were just grabbing them to take some pictures so you had a general sense of it. But this has got the different rind pattern. It's, if you can sell that, it's a smaller type fruit, but it's usually served decently and served as a pollenizer. And so if you could sell that seeded variety, that's one that you could consider, although I don't know that it has a lot of resistances. This is premium. We did not take sugar, or no, this is Estrella. Premium is down below, and you can see that has a little bit different rind pattern. We didn't really look at premium that much as far as the sugars. In fact, we probably ought to look at that this year just to test that. Polymax, another one that perhaps could be used and sold, but generally the sugars have been a little lower in that. Sentinel, which has been used a lot. But one thing I will mention is notice these rind patterns for Sentinel and for Estrella. You got to be careful if you do grow those, because a lot of your seedless rind patterns look similar. So you got to be very careful if you do use that or set it up in a way that you can easily distinguish, because you don't want to ship seeded and seedless watermelons together. And then somebody thinks they got a seedless and they get a seeded. Again, Summer Flavor was the other one that's been used quite a bit and sold as a seeded variety. You see these others here are not suitable. They're dedicated only for pollination purposes. And then another one from Cicada, SSX 8585, which is sold as a seeded variety. These other two, Wingman. So Wingman, which flowered really well, is definitely a dedicated pollenizer here. That's what the fruit looks like, and Wildcard Plus. So let me summarize those and what we had. I think one of the key things that you know, is that basically the SP7 and the SP6 really had as much flowering as any of them, and the next best flowering one being Wingman. And so those actually would be really complementary if you wanted to grow two pollenizers, which we do a lot. We usually use a mix of pollenizers, like 2 of them. And I would, in fact, that's what I was going to use in our variety test, because you have a nice disease package with SP6 and SP7. Wingman, you have that nice earliness. And I will tell you, I was surprised on some of the results, because one of the things that Cicada has claimed is we need to use their pollenizer because some of their materials earlier. And in this study, ACE Plus, and I'm trying to think of the other one that they sell, those 2 varieties or cultivars were no earlier as far as flowering than any of the other materials we had. So that to me did not hold water, that idea. But again, it's 1 year, and I'd like to see that again, to see if that's really the case, or we do get maybe earlier flowering if we were to look at those again from the varieties from Cicada. Accomplice and Sidekick had the most compact habit of the pollinizers that we did evaluate. And most of the pollinizers were pretty comparable in the number of male flowers produced over time. There were those exceptions that I just mentioned. And one does need to consider the disease resistances to improve the flowering over time. So if you want to hold those pollinizers and have a longer season, some of these like SB6 and 7 seem to have the best disease packages. Accomplice and Sidekick tended to have higher resistance to anthracnose, but I don't know that there was necessarily disease resistance to fusarium wilt. I think it might be a little different what Gordon might have mentioned, and he might correct me if I'm not quite stating that correctly there. Just want to make sure that's right. I want to acknowledge those folks that contributed, particularly the North Carolina Watermelon Association, which really supported this study. I want to thank also, most of the seed was given to or donated to us by Seedway, because they carried all these pollinizers from the different companies. And then Syngenta, which has their own their own way that they delve out through their full count program, the SB6 or 7. Also, there's a lot of people that we need to have to make this work, and there were the personnel at the Cunningham Research Station and those who were working with us that summer of 2019 in my program, and finally for the statistics that have been run on all these different studies that I talked about today. I want to thank Joy Smith. And with that, I have covered what I wanted to cover today.